I'd like to give the stage to Michael Taschner. He is the Global Head of Sustainability Solution at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and he will present on the regulatory framework of nature-related reporting. Michael.
So thank you very much, Michael, for the introduction. Maybe we can try to redo the Slido, but just in a more, let's say, old school fashion. And let's start with those who think, raise a hand. That was the idea. Maybe we can just indicate who is already familiar with the topic of nature and biodiversity. Okay, familiar is a big word. Who is at expert level? That's good. That's good. Thank you. So let's say everyone knows about the topic of nature and biodiversity, or everyone at least heard about the topic of nature and biodiversity. I think this is good. This is very important. But the survey also showed that expert level is, of course, per definition, the level where the least people are actually at. And I think this is this very well reflects the topic of nature and biodiversity, because nature and biodiversity is a term that sounds familiar, that is kind of tangible, but whenever we are digging into the details, it's getting a little bit more complex. In particular on interdependencies, in particular on what is required to be done, when is it required to be done, what's the purpose, is it regulatory reporting, is it risk management, is it for the purpose of disclosing it for a supply chain, is it for the purpose of identifying opportunities, maybe it's for all of those. To give a proper answer on these questions, I think it's important to understand what it's about, and that's also the idea, not entirely, but it's the idea to give you an overview on what we see, where it's progressing, what are the requirements from a regulatory point of view, but what are also requirements that are coming out of other regulatory frameworks. That said, let's kick it off with something that is not coming from us, because it's always easier to present something from other sources, because this is more credible, because of course those who offer services in this area, they are a little bit biased. But obviously we are not super biased, because also the World Economic Forum 2024-2025 showed that the topic of nature and biodiversity is a very high priority topic with regards to those risks that have been identified by those companies and those stakeholders that have been surveyed. And this is for a good reason. Nature and biodiversity is something that is getting more and more important. We are all already very familiar, I think, with the 4 letters of TCFD, and there is a reason why I'm pronouncing the C more than the rest. We are probably a little bit less experienced with the topic of TNFD. The good thing, though, is that the logic is very similar. The logic of how to approach it, the logic of using a framework to really quantify the impact, quantify risks, and manage them properly is a concept that is true for both areas. And I just now said something which actually I didn't want to say. I said both areas because it's not 2 areas. There is a strong overlap between those 2 areas. Before starting with the overlap, maybe showing something or some elements which you are for sure familiar with, which is the regulatory environment in Switzerland. So referring to the FINMA circular that is applicable as of the beginning of 2026 for financial institutions and insurance companies, category 1 and 2. And as of 2027, it is also applicable for category 3, 4, and 5 institutions. What is the requirement there? And that's, I think, something that Switzerland always is doing very well, It is very business-minded and is actually enabling the business and supporting the business how to integrate a specific topic very efficiently into business operations. So there is, and this is not a coincidence, there is a very strong overlap with the TNFD framework. So you see it on the right-hand side, the common provisions, risk management, identification, and identification of material topics by doing a materiality assessment and scenario analysis, risk management, stress testing. These topics, they are very familiar, as I said in the beginning, from TCFD, which again makes a lot of sense. In the beginning, you start identifying what is actually impacted, then the quantification needs to happen. Then the next level, which is the much more sophisticated level, is also the scenario analysis. In other words, testing the sensitivity of the business, testing the sensitivity of a supply chain or of a value chain, and then starting to mitigate those risks. But the next level is then also to identify what are the opportunities and how to integrate them into business operations. The provisions for the banks, there are additional banking-related issues such as credit risk and consideration of adjusting lending criteria. That makes, again, a lot of sense, because this is where it's now starting to connect with the existing operations of the credit institutions business and also of the insurance business, because the topic of nature and biodiversity and climate is a very risk-driven business. Risk needs to be identified and managed properly. So connecting it with how risks are managed is a very important element. TNFD is not so much focusing on it. Of course, TNFD is a framework that is sector agnostic, therefore not explicitly focusing on the financial industry. It is more generic, saying including it into the risk management systems, which has the same purpose, but in this case, it is very much focused on risk management of financial institutions. That's also one element that I think is important to highlight later in the round table. It's not a round table; it's actually stage. But in the discussion, it is the interdependency between financial institution and the real economy. What is the one party asking the other party? How are both elements connected? Because that's also not a surprise. The financial industry is supporting and enabling the real economy by investing, by providing funds, by being very active in financing new projects. Therefore, there is a huge accelerator there. And understanding what both parties are asking from each other is very important. That said, when talking about nature and biodiversity, I would like to use nature and biodiversity more interchangeably, not entirely interchangeably, but more interchangeably also with climate-related risks, because nature-related risks are climate-related risks. We tried to kind of show that on the left-hand side a bit, that there is on the more narrowed perspective, there are climate-related risks, such as the usual suspects of droughts, storms, heat waves. But then there are other nature-related risks, and all of them, they literally form nature-related risks as such. So it's not the one or the other, which is also very important when talking about the either-or, because there is not the either-or. Many companies, they approach it saying, okay, we now focus on TCFD. Now, luckily, there is no TCFD anymore. We now call it ISSB, still very much focused on climate. TNFD, nature and biodiversity, is priority number 2, maybe priority number 3, which is not entirely true because both of them have a strong overlap. On the right-hand side, we also try to indicate a little bit the rationale of what is impacting what. It should be logic that there is a strong correlation, that increasing temperatures, that they create certain results and certain consequences. There are more wildfires, decreased floods and storm protection can lead to increased soil erosion. So there is a strong interdependency, and the topic of impact and interdependency is a key concept of TNFD. We'll see that later also on one slide, which is the indication of what is depending on what. That's where now the complexity is actually starting. And that's also where the complexity from a financial institution perspective starts, because very technically speaking, in a portfolio management approach, interdependency, correlations, they are supposed to be considered to make the right decision, or at least to understand which decision create which impact. Talking about impact and nature-related risks, what you see here is a concept that S&P, together with UNEP, and we will hear about that later as well, wouldn't say develop, but actually created as a research product, which is that nature-related risks, they consist of impact on nature and dependencies on nature. That is I wouldn't say a new way of thinking, but in other risk categories and other risk classes, when quantifying them, this approach is not that common. Implicitly, yes, explicitly, not yet. So the impact on nature and the dependency on nature, you might feel that this is somehow related to the topic of double materiality. Yes, looking on both sides makes a lot of sense. Same is happening here. The impact on nature, so on nature, is very important, and with regards to the magnitude of the impact and the significance of the location. We see that later when talking about the LEAP approach, because from an operational perspective, it is important to understand where are the location, what is the magnitude of the impact, quantifying that and aggregating that up from the bottom. So it is a very bottom-up approach. And the dependency on nature, that's now again, that's more the real economy, where a business is depending on nature, in particular long-term planning activities. So the resilience or the reliance on ecosystem services and the resilience of ecosystem services, in particular sectors. There are the most obvious one. We have agricultural sector, we have a fertilizer sector, we have the sector of certain commodities that are heavily depending on the resilience of nature. There are a number of examples. Will not try to name all of them, but there are many examples there that make sense to consider in the business and the risk evaluation. I like this approach, and I like this flip side pyramid, not only because it's very colorful, but also because it indicates quite well how to approach it to start from a very broad perspective and narrowing it down. TNFD or the framework came up with new 4 letters, so LEAP. LEAP stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. Kind of a logical sequence. Still important to follow this logical sequence and to give so this concept gives a good guidance. The LEAP is literally identify the locations, identifying the assets, identifying which assets are exposed to which extent, and at least knowing which assets have which value in the corporate environment and also in the supply chain. There is no limitation to which extent vulnerable assets are being considered. But the second step is the evaluation. So this is really the evaluation of the impact. How are which assets impacted? How are which supply chains being impacted? Is there a certain concentration risk? And then taking it forward with regards to assessing the risk and preparing for the risk. This is kind of a circle of the management. And as soon as this has been done, the next step is the disclosure. We're talking a lot about disclosure from a positive and from a negative point of view, but the requirement of disclosing something requires you to understand what you're supposed to disclose. So that said, again, it sounds very logic, but this is also an approach from the regulator, from standard setter, to put the framework in place and the disclosure requirement in place, which feels very prescriptive, which feels very regulatory driven, but it also supports companies to even start thinking about those kind of risks. Because again, technically speaking, these are still idiosyncratic risks, which just in many cases can't be explained. There is this kind of risk bucket in a portfolio which behaves, I wouldn't say randomly, but there is little explanation of why certain elements of a portfolio are behaving as they are behaving. And I would be interested also later, I don't know how the questions will look like, but maybe you can talk about that as well, how this risk management from a financial institution is being considered. Kieran, yes, that goes in your direction. And what is the degree of importance on that? And the same, I mean, we all answered all these questions a couple of years ago for TCFD, and we can learn a lot from that, and we don't need to actually make the same, or actually, wouldn't say make the same errors, but we don't need to fail again as we did in the TCFD approach, so we can accelerate a lot there from benefiting what we did in TCFD. Here are a couple of examples. The examples are based not only on a very theoretical analysis, rather than they are based on a very intensive quantitative analysis that S&P did for 20,000 companies, which included 3.1 million assets for climate risk and 1.6 million assets for nature-related risks. I will keep it very high level because I saw the sign that I'm running over. So we selected two sectors. The one is the electronic equipment sector. The second one is the water utility sector. And focusing on the water utility sector, we see that from a climate perspective, water stress, and from a nature perspective, dependency on mass stabilization and erosion control, they have a negative impact. By understanding that, and understanding all the different data points that are actually creating impact in a portfolio, these multiple correlation metrics or multi-dimensional metrics can be implemented to really create a very good holistic view on what are the risks and what are dependencies and what are actually the consequences of certain activities in a portfolio and in the management of a larger portfolio of risk drivers. Very last slide. You will likely get all those slides later. But this is a good overview also on sensitivity, how different sections are correlating to each other. It does not indicate positive or negative correlation, but it indicates the sensitivity of certain correlations. And by no surprise, climate regulation impacts all different climate-related hazards. Flood and storm protection can positively impact pluvial floods, coastal floods, and fluvial floods. I will not go through all those intersections, but this is the logic there. And what we see is there is a very strong correlation, very strong overlap between climate-related activities and nature-related consequences. That said, we're almost done, except this slide, which we can cover very quickly, which just indicates that the work that S&P did on that since when we are doing it, and that there is a lot of very insightful information available on this topic in the public domain. Please feel free to reach out to the public domain. You can also reach out to us, of course. But that is pretty much the idea of all the research that has been done. Leveraging also public information. Many other sources are also providing very valuable information, but the aggregation of that and the translation into meaningful outputs is really what makes the topic then operational. Now I'm done. Thank you very much.